Hi, good afternoon to all of you. So, welcome you back after such a good lunch. And I think every one of you are sleepy, but the session will not make you sleepy. We have a nice session in front of us. It is a frontier of development economics, and we have four interesting paper that will be discussed. And whenever I see a session with frontier in front of it, it is really exciting because I think it always challenges the boundary and expands the boundary in which direction it wants. And it is a macroeconomic session, so it will be both challenging in terms of theoretical input. It might be a micro foundation or heterodox or structural approach, that doesn't matter. But what matters is that what is the question they are trying to address and how they are trying to solve the problem. So the four papers that will be discussed is the first paper by Rohit and Dipa. It is the Great Indian Boom of 2000, the role of mass consumption. This is the first paper. The second paper is by Sukanya, Bose and Saikat Banerjee. It is Human Development, Growth, Distribution, a Micro Fiscal Framework for India. The third paper is by Ziko Dasgupta. It is Income Distribution and Employment in the Export-Led Growth, a neo-Keynesian conflicting claims framework for India. And the final one, the fourth one, is by Raghav Srinivasan and Ananya Agarwal, Economic Growth and Gender Equality in India, Gender-Sensitive Macroeconomic Policy Analysis. So the session will be arranged in the following way. We have four papers, so each paper will have 15 minutes of presentation time, and then it will be followed by discussion of the four papers, for which we have 20 minutes by Partha. Then after the discussion, we will open the floor for questions. So it will be 10 minutes. I think the authors can take the question, one or two questions, or a general question depending on the entire session, and then it can be discussed. Okay, so I will request all the authors to stick to that 15 minutes time so that we have more discussion afterward. So thank you, and the all stage for you, Rohit.
Thanks, Dr. Shaw. My question is, will we get an ultimatum 2 minutes ahead? Perfect. Otherwise, giving a mic to especially a teacher from JNU is like they never give up. It's a presentation that it's a paper that both of us have written. We'll be very brief in terms of the arguments that we are making. This is about the Great Indian Boom of the 2000s, and we are focusing on something you'll see on the role of mass consumption. So the attempt of the paper is to explain one of the drivers of growth in India between 2004 and 11, which is an unprecedented boom that took place in India. GDP, this is just to give you an overview. GDP is consumption plus government expenditure. That is consumption expenditure, investment private, investment public, which is government expenditure, and export minus imports. There are four broad frameworks, theoretical frameworks in the heterodox economics in the Indian context, which has tried to explain the Indian growth story from four different perspectives. And I'll just show you. So Professor Patnaik's argument has primarily been that this is led by consumption of the capitalists. It's their consumption which led to the boom that we saw. Basu and Das, their argument is that it's the private investment which is profit-led. So it's the Bhadri Maglin kind of a framework where it's profit-led. This is another paper, one paper that we wrote, which is essentially, again, private investment explanation, but it comes from finance, that it was essentially a bank-led, bank credit-led boom. And last, Ziko is here, his paper, which is on the exports playing a role. This paper, the one that we are presenting, is essentially focusing on this first component, which is usually has not been really worked upon, definitely not in macroeconomic theory and policy. So our focus is on the role of mass consumption in making and sustaining this economic growth, and to assess the role of government transfers in generating this growth, the way you'll see through the paper. Before we begin, just three stylized facts to give you a context of where we are coming from. First is this chart which essentially tells you if you were to divide the post-reform period in three parts. One which was pre-UPA, which is 91 to 2003, so Narasimha Rao and the coalition governments and Vajpayee. And the second one is 2004 to 11. We'll explain why we are picking just 2004 to 11. And the next is basically 12 to 23, which is currently. And you can see that there is something which happens here, which is exceptional in terms of, purely in terms of growth, without going into the inequitous growth trajectory that it had. And this U-shaped is something that you follow that is true for all the components of demand. But while consumption grew at an unprecedented rate, it's the consumption of the top 20% of the population, their share actually fell during, and that is an intriguing thing which we want. This is what started this paper. So you see there is a rise in inequality that takes place. So the income share of top 20% is actually rising throughout the post-reform period, or even before that, 1980 is when it starts. And lower one is income, yeah. So income share of top 20, whereas if you look at the consumption share, while the inequality was rising, except for the phase between 2004 and 11, that's exactly the period that we pick for our paper, you actually see a fall in the share of consumption. So their incomes were rising, but their consumption was not rising as fast as the overall consumption. That's why the share would fall. So in absolute terms, of course, consumption was rising. So the question is, why did that happen? The third stylized fact is this. So our focus is on this number that you see there. It's an annual growth rate of 5.8% for these 7 years. And this is unprecedented. While this was growing, you actually find a fall in the share of the top 20%, which essentially means effectively that the bottom 80% of the population, there was a dramatic rise in consumption out of this share itself. So I'll now give it to Dipa.
Thank you. So just moving on, starting with these stylized facts, the question we were basically trying to look at is, where is this demand coming from and what are the factors that are driving these demand? And through this also trying to bring together sort of the literature on poverty reduction and employment, which has discussed all of this in the context of explaining growth as well. So it's not like entirely new, but bringing these two kind of areas of literature together and say that it's not only a contribution to reduction in poverty, which was the fastest during this period, as well as some kind of structural transformation that we did see in employment. Santosh is here and has written a lot about it, again, during the same very period. So before getting there, again, just going back to, therefore, the theoretical framework within which we are working, in very simple terms, just that if the incomes of those who are poorer, who consume more, have a higher propensity to consume, grow, then that contributes to a higher multiplier and you see a growth. So we just wanted to test this before we moved on, saying that this is where we are focusing, saying that it is the incomes of the bottom 80% and how that contributed to increased consumption. So we use the IHDS panel data, and just because it is one source which has information on both income as well as consumption, given all the limitations of the income data, all we are trying to look at here is to see, just run this very simple regression and see, is the MPC amongst the poorer groups higher than the richer groups? And like we can see in the table, and we've just given this bottom 80 versus the top breakup because of what Rohit just showed you. And also, as you'll see later in the paper, that's how we're looking at the economy as well, that the entire unorganized sector plus agriculture is moving in a certain way, and it is just the top 20 is doing differently. And you can see very clearly the coefficient is higher for the bottom groups in both the time periods that we look at. Another way of looking at this, as we know, the macro consumption data, the national income data, doesn't give us a breakup of which class is consuming how much or how the consumption is growing by the economic location of any group. So one way to look at it, and this is very common, we read it in the newspapers all the time in relation to the current period as well, that there are certain, the lower part, certain bellwether commodities that you look at, and usually two-wheelers and three-wheelers are something that more the bottom 80% would consume, whereas bicycles and two-wheelers and cars would be something that the richer would buy. So for the period that we are looking at, 2004-11, you see that there was a growth in the consumption of all of these categories. Bicycles a little slower, but even that was positive. Also, there is a substitution of cycles to two-wheelers that we did see in this period. Whereas in the current period, and in this paper, we are not really talking very much about the current period, but in a few things, we'll just try and make this comparison. In the present, the last 10 years, you see that actually cycles and three-wheelers and two-wheelers is where consumption has gone down, including cars. So that consumption was playing a role previous period and is a problem currently, is both that we can see from this. Similarly, if we look at it as a breakup of durables, semi and non-durables, durables one could assume is more consumed by the richer sections, whereas semi-durables and non-durables by the poorer. There again, you see that in the period that we are looking at, there is a growth in the semi-durables, and non-durables would include food, which is inelastic and therefore would not show a higher proportion. From the IHDS data also, we try to look at build growth in these consumption categories from the consumption expenditure module of the IHDS data. Again, looking at bottom 80, top 20. Broadly, is a similar thing that in most consumption categories, the growth rate is much higher for the bottom 80%, in some negative also for the top 20. Again, given the caveats that capturing consumption of the rich in these kind of surveys, there are limitations to that and all, and so on. But overall, that one does see from these various data sources that we try to put together, that there does seem to be a story of consumption growth amongst the bottom 80%. So how do we explain this? I'll just come to this graph in a minute. So there are two factors we are basically looking at in what explains this. And what we are focusing on here is government policy and public expenditure during this period. I'm happy Santosh is here. We did a lot of work around many of this. And the point was also to extend it to say it's not just about that program, but what was the macroeconomic impact of this expenditure, where it is not just in terms of the quantity of expenditure, but also the nature of expenditure. And what that did to the rest of the economy, one, through putting incomes into the hands of people directly, and therefore the multiplier, but also what is the changes that it brought about in the employment and the broader economy, in the wages and so on, which also again contributed to these sections, incomes rising and consumption rising. So we broadly look at two, and this is only union government expenditure. If we look at state governments, there could be a more nuanced story that we can tell, and very two broad categories of expenditure that we've taken. Social sector expenditure, social services as a proportion share of total expenditure, and development expenditure as a share of total expenditure. We've done that, not included in the paper. Also, this looks nicer because the numbers are slightly bigger. Otherwise, the left graph will be all at zero. So again, the story is very clear. The kind of view that Rohit showed in the macro indicators is something you see in the fiscal indicators as well. And the left panel, social services, would broadly fit into what I was saying as being the direct, where you can expect that this is expenditure which directly went into the hands of the poor in various forms. So it could have been Narega wages, it could have been an income transfer through the expanded PDS, or various other kinds of programs that did get initiated during this period, which all continue to exist now with different names and lower funds. But there were a huge set of schemes that came in at this time. Development expenditure would include social services plus economic services, and therefore that would also include your rural development expenditure, things like your Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, part of NREGA probably would come here. And so, although we don't have the breakup of this, and that's again something we've not gone into that kind of detail in the empirical work in the paper, but we know again from comparing with say current that one is you do see that the development expenditure as a share of total has gone down, but even within this, the nature is something that is changing. And there will be more discussion on this, I think, tomorrow when we're discussing Lewis's book, where she, and similar things that we observed, that in the 4 to 11 period that we are looking at, you also saw a simultaneous shift towards rights-based legislations, towards expansion in the number of schemes, which were more, again, rights-based, vis-a-vis the DBT sort of expenditure that we see currently. Second, the push towards capital expenditure also. If we look at the composition of capital expenditure, currently the focus seems to be more on the large PPP infrastructure projects, whereas earlier the share of even Narega within this, or Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana and so on, would be higher. How are they different? One directly puts income into the hands of people. We are arguing that this one contributed in various ways to increase wages, to diversifying employment and so on. For example, if you look at wage rates, and there is literature around this, that in the initial years after Narega was introduced, there was an increase in rural wage rate, and there are papers which have said that Narega contributed to this because the initial Narega wage was higher than what the market wage was. Okay, I have to quickly rush because we have much more. And the second is what we'll refer you to all of Santosh's papers in EPW and other places, that you see a shift out of agriculture into non-agriculture. Of course, it was informal and construction and all of that, but that shift did happen. And from the ISDS data also, you see that the growth in incomes from these sources, although benefits is a small proportion of total income, there was a huge growth in the contribution of benefits to income, remittances, which would again include migration, wages and salary, and so on. So broadly, what we're trying to do in this empirical part is to try and explain this consumption in this 4 to 11 period by saying that this has something to do with policy and government expenditure as well, both direct and indirect. Using this, Rohit will now talk about.
Usually we do in macro, let's say a 3-sector model usually would be agriculture, industry and services. Whereas what we think the framework should be actually divided in agriculture, unorganized and organized, which is a far better macroeconomic framework, particularly for the third world economy. So if we were to do that, this is calculated from NAS. As you can see, there is, from the supply side, there's a huge jump which almost similar to this, which is almost doubling of the gross value added if you were to divide the economy in these 3 sectors. So there is a dramatic jump that takes place in the unorganized sector, which is essentially the goods which the poorer sections of the population would be demanding, and it's there where the growth is located. And briefly, if you were to do it in our favorite 3-box diagram, we have all done macro in boxes. So Kaliski's boxes, you have basically employment here and gross value added there. The 3 sectors are agriculture, unorganized sector, and organized sector. And you can see the jump that takes place in the red line is essentially an increase in productivity. There is hardly any employment increase. In fact, employment just goes up from 2.5 to 2.8. The jump here is basically both in employment and in value added. So it effectively means that these are the sectors which actually absorbed labor which came out of agriculture. Something again that Santosh has written extensively about. Last slide and I'm done. If you were to build a macroeconomic framework based on this, this is what we've tried to do here. These are the 3 sectors. The injection of demand essentially comes from the government expenditure that Dipa just mentioned, which essentially increases the wage bill of each of, particularly of these 2 sectors. That increase in wage bill creates demand for the unorganized sector, which is what you have here. Forget about the equation here. And this box essentially is the surplus which needs to be equal to these 2. This is the demand of the organized sector workers for the unorganized sector output, having domestic help, etc., and also the inputs that this sector would require. So an equilibrium would require this A plus B is equal to C. The expansion of this C is what our focus was on, and that is happening because government itself was playing a proactive role through the rights-based approach, which created this demand and the growth story in India. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Am I audible to everyone? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to be speaking about this social spending and fiscal policy in India towards an alternate macro-fiscal framework integrating human development. I come from a policy space, so my take would be somewhat different than of the other academicians in the panel. Let me start by outlining the presentation, what we are going to be speaking about. We are going to be beginning with this divergence in performance on economic growth and human development, which is a stylized fact, and its connection to social spending. We do a fiscal policy as a constraint on social expenditure. We review the experience of 30 years, and it's somewhat different from what Dipa has put across, so therefore it's going to be interesting. Contours of an alternate macro-fiscal framework is what we are trying to get to. That's work in progress. I'll do the first two parts and hand it over to Saikat, my co-panelist. If you look at the divergence in performance on growth and human development, and this is a well-known fact, in the past decade, India's rank in HDI among 190 plus countries has hardly moved. Between 1990 and 2012, there was substantial improvement. There was an impressive growth performance in terms of per capita income, but much more modest when it comes to improvement in HDI. In this paper, we attribute the divergence to India's performance, this divergence to social spending. Let me show you a set of graphs to exactly pinpoint what I'm talking about. But before that, the analytical framework which comes from Renaissance to Earth, which connects economic growth to human development through a dynamic analytical framework, where there are these two chains, one chain running from economic growth to human development, which essentially means that the economic growth is going to generate the necessary resources, which are then going to be plowed back into human development progress. And then human development progress through the creating capabilities, these crucial capabilities, will contribute to economic growth. Notice these two red boxes, which is essentially the fiscal policy. And this is the government expenditure on which we are going to be concentrating on. But also is very important is the distribution of income, or the share of intra-household distribution of income, share of females in the income distribution within the households. Those are also very important causative factors. Now, when we look at the social expenditure as a proportion of GDP, and this is center plus state consolidated, it's not just center or states alone. This is what we come up with. There is some movement, but very little when we consider these three sectors: education, health, and others. About 1% increase in 30 years in the social expenditure to GDP ratio. This is not how the international experience looks like. When you see the international experience, and this comes from IMF working paper, that with rise in per capita income, social spending as a proportion of GDP, and especially human development spending to GDP, tends to increase, whereas the trend has been very stagnant in case of India, especially when you look at the bottom two bars, which is education and health. When we compare the two endpoints, which is 1991 and 2019-20, this comes out very clearly, 1% increase in social spending, whereas when it comes to education and health, and most of this has gone into the other sector, not to education and health. And so there is a big gap when you consider the normative targets. The normative targets on national education policy or the health policy vis-a-vis where we are now, we are about half of that benchmark. This was a work that we did on the resource requirements for the right to education. What are the RTE compliant expenditure requirements if you do it through unit level data? And what we find is that the resource requirements is not only high, it is about additional resource requirement is about 1.4% of GDP for elementary education alone. It is also very unequally distributed across states of India, which is a peculiar feature of the Indian situation. right to education as per the Right to Education Act, which is a 6 to 14 age group. So if we are to break this social sector expenditure to human development to GDP in terms of its constituent ratios, we come up with three interesting ratios, which is the relative size of the government, secondly, the social allocation ratio, what is the social spending to total expenditure, and the third is in the priority ratio, which in our case we define it as the importance or the priority given to the human development sectors, which is education and health. So this is the picture that you come up with. The overall size of the government has actually shrunk over the 30-year period from 28.4% to we are now 26.9% as a proportion of GDP. So the overall size of the cake has not increased if you consider it as a proportion of GDP. Secondly, within the total expenditure, the share of social expenditure has increased somewhat. Yes, but then within social expenditure, as other sectors begin to occupy more and more of the fiscal space, education and health has been pushed out, and there you see a declining trend. Now, this leads us to the next part of the presentation, which is that what does it tell us about fiscal policy, and can we trace it to fiscal policy? Here we will argue that it is not the macroeconomic performance because of which you see the social spending in the way that we saw it is at the stagnation. We see that this is an outcome of the fiscal framework. We see it as an outcome of the fiscal choices. We see it as an outcome of the fiscal design. So it comes out of conscious policy choices that we have made. It is not an outcome of macroeconomic performance as it is made out of to be. So let me start by pointing out what is missing in this fiscal framework. The fiscal framework essentially misses out on the link between social spending to development and growth. And it does it in essential ways. And here I quote Professor Deepak Nair, that spending on human development can both mobilize and create resources. By imparting capabilities, it mobilizes the most abundant yet underutilized resource, which is people for development. The absorption of surplus labor in employment then is an important source of economic growth, which is the supply side. And the same people who constitute resources on the supply side provide markets on the demand side. That this is a fundamental link and the concept which is missing from the fiscal understanding. So what you have, you think of social spending as a sink which is not giving any returns, or you think of social spending and redistribution as a kind of a charity. So another way of expressing the same is that it underestimates the returns from social spending to secure development outcomes. There is something called the outcome budget which comes out, but which comes out of a paradigm of public financial management where the point is to get the best buck out of that money, the maximum returns out of that money. It doesn't come out of the social understanding of how that expenditure is going to have manifold impact in the society. Therefore, the self-sustaining mechanisms which is implied in a social spending or public expenditure is therefore also missing, and it is not recognized. We are left with a static understanding of the fiscal space where you have a constrained physical space from which is apportioned between different heads. You do not have a dynamic understanding where fiscal space itself can be reimagined. Fiscal space itself is endogenous to the system. Okay. So, what do we have? Let me elaborate a bit more. And the prevailing framework for fiscal policy, therefore, is anchored in the fiscal rule, or the FRBM as we know. Fiscal consolidation is the main policy strategy, which directly emerges from the new macroeconomic consensus. And at the core of the fiscal rule is the view that fiscal deficit hurts savings, investment, and growth, though we have enough evidence to the contrary. Our own work on fiscal multipliers does show that it is far greater than 1, and so that fiscal spending will have is expansionary. Now, therefore, what we see when we see this 30-year period, we see that the fiscal adjustment, which began with a structural adjustment program, has been a continuous feature, and fiscal policy has been intent on meeting the debt deficit targets, creating a deflationary bias. So what does it mean? What has it meant for the social spending? That instead of generating additional fiscal space, social spending is treated as residual absorbing macroeconomic shocks. The empirical results, which we don't show here because of the paucity of time, which shows in this paper, shows that the spending on education and health is a casualty of fiscal consolidation, low revenue mobilization, and low prioritization. This is an ARDL model based on the past 30 years. The second thing, which an empirical result which comes out sharply, and again, in a way challenges what Dipa has said, so which is exciting. Occasional revenue buoyancy is used for fiscal adjustment rather than social spending. And here, let me show the graph. The first thing to note is that over these 30-year period, except for that one period, which is the 2000s to 2007-8 period, or 2002-3 to 2007-8 period, the revenue buoyancy has been almost missing. It has been, the tax ratios have been pretty much flat. So you began at 18.4% of GDP as the overall revenue GDP ratio. We end 1920, we are at 19.2%. But there have been, one phase of revenue buoyancy, and during that phase, you see most of the fiscal space was used for improving the fiscal balance rather than devoting it to social spending. Again, here the definition of social spending is consolidated center plus states. There are other ways in which the present fiscal framework is misaligned to social spending, which is it enforces the same deficit and debt targets across states. And then the golden rule in the FRBM requires the government to borrow only to meet capital expenditure, which means it disincentivizes states to spend on revenue expenditure. And most of education and health expenditure is revenue expenditure. These are the figures. 97% of education expenditure is revenue expenditure. 89% of the health expenditure is revenue expenditure. So there's an inbuilt disincentive within the fiscal rule. So with this, I'll stop and just say that if you want to reimagine the fiscal space to finance public education, public health, we need to reimagine it is important, and to uphold the public good nature of these sectors, we need to reimagine the fiscal policy. Then what should be the contours of that? Saikat will flesh out a few points.
First thing is that the performance, there's been divergence between AGD performance and growth performance. And 2, this has been a structural problem. 3, social sector expenditure is found to be one of the key determinant of that. So under that circumstances, we develop an alternate macro fiscal framework which is consistent with rising public expenditure so that we can address the structural problem. So in the essential features of this modeler, first, HD component is, we explicitly integrate HD component, human development component, in the macro fiscal framework. We call it a social determinant of investment. Here we give fiscal policy 2 roles, one address to demand problem, another remove of structural constraint. Now, here, an important assumption of our model is that lack of SDI can potentially reduce private investment and export and depress demand. Now, the idea of bringing SDI and linking it to macroeconomy is rooted in many writings. One of this is Hirschman, who has conceptualized social overhead capital as those basic delivery without which primary, secondary, tertiary sector cannot function. Social overhead capital can act as a spur to overall investment through which backward and forward linkages. The second important feature of our model is that we treat HD spending as an investment, not as a current consumption. Now, in the public finance expenditure, there's been expenditure hierarchy where capital expenditure is thought as asset creating, while revenue expenditures are not. And most of the HD expenditures are revenue expenditures. So actually, these obvious flaws were also earlier been flagged off in the wake of FRBM Act. The approach paper of 11 5-year plan suggested that reclassifying education and health as a capital expenditure. It was an important recommendation which was finally not accepted. The third thing that we go away is we replace intertemporal budget constraint of debt sustainability with a long-term DOMAR condition of debt stability. And finally, I think a dynamic approach of fiscal space is considered, which involves a better understanding of the long-term effect of fiscal expansion. And finally, we also explicitly consider the distributional outcomes as an important role in human development. Thank you.
So this paper is essentially about thinking about three macroeconomic variables which have been considered to be extremely important from the perspective of developing countries historically. One is the GDP growth rate. The second is income share of labor, or what we would term as the wage share. And third is the employment growth rate. What we say or what we mean by employment growth rate over here is not only in aggregate terms, but what is important for structural transformation as well. Employment growth rate in the non-agricultural sector, which has largely moved in the same direction as the growth rate of the salaried workers as well, which is one of the important considerations for structural transformation. Now, as far as the globalization period is concerned, different developing countries have had different kinds of experiences, which are not homogeneous in nature, in terms of how their growth have changed, how their income share of labor has changed, and also in terms of how the employment growth rate has changed. Now, India had a particular feature as far as all these varied experience of the developing countries are concerned. And the feature is the following, that during the liberalization period as compared to the earlier period, India registered higher GDP growth rate. India experienced lower income share of labor as compared to the previous period. And also India experienced a weak relationship between the GDP growth rate and the employment growth rate. So two questions follow from here, of course, that what are the underlying mechanisms and economic structures that bring about this triple phenomenon together? And the second is that how similar and different are these structural features or mechanisms, what we see in India, from other countries. Now, of course, different, this have been a typical set of questions which demand side theories, structuralist theories typically deal on. We have looked at in a particular context. So basically this paper aims to address these questions in 3 steps. First, we highlight few stylized facts or provide a broad analytical overview of the trend in the GDP growth rate, wage share and employment growth rate to highlight 2 points. First, we would argue that the first feature 1, which is higher GDP growth rate, can be largely attributed to higher global demand and export growth rate. Where features 2 and 3, we would see that India shares this feature common to different developing countries who have very low, very high Calder-Verden coefficient. What we would mean by Calder-Verden coefficient is the magnitude by which the labor productivity growth rate changes in response to 1 unit change in the output growth rate of the GVA growth rate. So the question is that what explains that India would share this common feature of feature 2 and 3 with different developing countries which have high Calder-Verden coefficient, and how do we explain in the larger framework when export growth rate changes or export growth rate rises? Now, second, what we do, and this is the second and the third step, that based on these stylized facts, we construct a structuralist model. The characteristic feature of that model is that different growth regimes are possible under high growth, And the growth regimes are defined in terms of how the wage share and the employment growth rate responds in terms of changes in the output growth rate. Now, once we lay out different possibilities of how wage share and employment growth rate can respond to output growth rate under different structural conditions, and we shall see that these conditions typically depend on the Calder-Verden coefficient of that country with respect to the bargaining power of the workers. That's what the model basically argues. As a third step, we would try to locate India as a particular case, as a specific case of one particular growth regime where higher export growth rate in itself generates lower wage share and weak relationships with respect to the employment growth rate. Now, before I go on further, just one quick point that these relationship between distribution and growth, it's not that we are doing for the first time. That's not the novelty of the model. Different kinds of wage-led, profit-led models, Keynesian models typically do that. But the causation in those models typically lie from income distribution to growth. In other words, what these models typically try to look at, that if wage share changes for whatever reason, what is the effect on growth? We are asking a different question. That if growth changes for some reason or the other, say for exports, why and how the wage share changes? If it increases, why? If it reduces, why? The broad argument of the paper is the following, that this paper identifies exports as a key stimulus for India's high growth, and it identifies high Calder-Verden coefficient as a key factor for explaining features 2 and 3. Depending on the relative strength of these parameters, we divide growth regimes into 4 possible categories: inequality decreasing job creating, inequality unaltering job creating, inequality increasing job creating, and inequality increasing jobless. And based on the stylized facts, we perceive India to be largely lying on the regime 4, but in the paper we have indicated that there are signs that India may be shifting towards regime 3 in the recent period. But largely the focus is on trying to construct an analytical framework to understand the relationship between these 3 variables, particularly in the Indian context. I'll quickly go through some of the stylized facts. So just to understand the nature of high growth that we experienced, the table gives 4 different periods. These 4 different periods are estimated through the standard biparent exercise. For these 4 different periods, the trend GDP growth rate are statistically different. As you would see that, particularly from the mid-80s onwards, which is defined or described as period 3 and period 4, the trend GDP growth rate is substantially higher than the previous 2 periods. What is important, or what is quite well known rather, that these latter 2 periods were associated with sharp rise in the contribution of gross capital formation and exports in the GDP growth. So basically this table gives the contribution of different components of expenditures in GDP growth rate. It's not a contribution in the level of GDP, but the growth rate of GDP. So exports and investments increased in the last 2 periods, and drawing from recent empirical literature which argues about exports playing a stimulating role for investment in the recent period, we also see a broad trend which largely shows that export rate, export capital ratio and the investment capital ratio largely moving in the same direction, and export capital ratio sharply picking up post-2000s, which has been associated with higher investment rate. Export growth rate, so this figure basically gives 3 things. The blue line is India's export growth rate. The red line is the growth rate of rest of the world imports, which is an indicator of global demand. And the green line is the level of real exchange rate. Increase meaning appreciation, decrease meaning depreciation. So India's export growth rate has largely followed the global trend. And despite an appreciation of the real exchange rate since the 2000s, India's export growth rate largely can be perceived to increase during times of high global demand. No, so this is only merchandise, but aggregate-wise would also follow the same trend. So, but this figure, you're right, it only plots the merchandise. This is from the WITS database. So the broad trends in the employment and distribution. The first thing that we try to do, because Calder-Verden coefficient plays an important role in the analysis, We first try to calculate the Calder-Verden coefficient of 34 developing countries. So we plot it, or we estimate the Calder-Verden coefficient both for the non-agricultural sector as well as the aggregate sector. The reason for doing particularly the non-agricultural sector is because that is a sector which is important for structural transformation, and also this is a part which has resemblance with the salaried workers, which is not a residual part of the labor market. So this is largely the distribution of the Calder-Verden coefficient of different developing countries. The point to note is that India's Calder-Verden coefficient, which is the red line, is pretty high as compared to the median value and largely lies around the value of 1. Now, why is it important? Why are we at all interested in this Calder-Verden coefficient? But before just doing that, we do another exercise to distinguish between low KV countries or low Calder-Verden countries with the high Calder-Verden countries. What we do is, we describe those countries which have Calder-Verden coefficient less than the median. We describe them as the low KV countries, and countries which have Calder-Verden coefficient higher than the median, we describe them as the high KV countries. And of course, these are the lists. India would fall under the high KV countries, and say countries like this, Brazil, China would fall under the low KV countries. The characteristic feature of these high KV countries, one can see it in the right plot, is the weak relationship between output growth rate and employment growth rate. This is a scatter plot which plots the change in the GVA growth rate with respect to the change in the employment growth rate. The horizontal line, the trend line, what it shows that there is a weak relationship between growth and employment in these high KV countries with respect to the low KV countries, where high GVA growth rate, higher GVA growth rate during the 2000s as compared to 90s was associated with higher employment growth rate. Lower GVA growth rate was associated with lower employment growth rate. The right panel, the high KV countries, despite having higher GVA growth rate, the improvement of employment growth rate has been negligible for most countries, and vice versa. This is, I'm not going into the detail, this is well known, this is from the claims database, that as compared to the 80s, if one have the average values of the 1980s on one hand and 1990s and 2000s and 2010s on the other, one would see that the average GVA growth rates, both in the manufacturing sector as well as the non-agricultural sector, would go up, but the employment growth rate hasn't, which again reflects the weak relationship between growth and employment. Finally, relationship between growth and distribution, and this is important. This plots the change in the GVA growth rate with the changes in the wage share. As you would see that the black dots are the low KV countries, the red dots are the high KV countries. There's a clear distinction between how the pattern looks as far as the relationship between these variables are concerned. As you would see for the red dots, large number of countries who have registered higher GVA growth rate have witnessed lower wage share, and the other way around, lower GVA growth rates have been associated with higher wage shares. And India, of course, is one of those data points of those red dots, and it shares that feature 3 with many other high KV countries. And that's the essential motivating part of the model. Do I have 2 minutes? So I don't have the time to go through the details of the model, the dynamics of it, the comparative dynamics of it. I'll just want to give a broad sense about the causal structure of the model to get a sense what I'm trying to do. So first, some basic definition that employment growth rate is just the difference between output growth rate and the labor productivity growth rate. Wage share is the ratio between the wage rate and the level of labor productivity. And one can easily follow that higher output growth rate at any given labor productivity would increase employment growth rate by increasing labor demand. Higher labor productivity at a given output growth rate reduces employment growth rate because the same amount of output can be achieved or produced by less labor due to automation and increasing labor productivity. Higher wage rate increases wage share. higher labor productivity at a given wage rate reduces wage share. Straightforward. This is largely the broad causal structure of the model. Few things to note. I just wanted to point out the basis in which the growth regimes have been classified. Arrow, it's useful to understand the causal structure through these different arrows. These arrows reflect different channels through which exports or output growth influences income distribution as well as employment growth. So channel A or arrow A reflects the direct positive effect of output growth rate on employment growth rate by increasing labor demand. Channel B is the direct negative effect of labor productivity growth rate on employment growth rate. Channel C is the Calder-Verdun channel, which gives the response of the productivity growth rate to output growth rate, which means that output growth rate has two opposite effects on the employment growth rate. One that operates through channel A, and the negative effect operates through the combined channel B and channel C. So depending on the relative strength of these two different channels, growth regimes can be either job creating or jobless. For the wage share, we distinguish between two kinds of effects of the growth. One, what we call as the reserve army effect. The second, what we call as the productivity effect. Now, because wage share is a ratio between wage rate and productivity, higher employment due to higher growth can push up wage rate due to greater bargaining power of the workers, which we call as the reserve army effect. But higher productivity can reduce wage share because it's the ratio of the denominator going up, which we call as the productivity effect. Depending on the respective strength of these channels, regimes can be inequality decreasing, inequality unaltering, or inequality increasing. And based on this, we have those four growth regimes, and based on the stylized facts, we would like to perceive India as a particular case of regime 4, where higher growth is unable to push up employment growth rate due to high Calder-Verdun coefficient, because productivity growth rate increases proportionately. But because of very high Calder-Verdun effect and the productivity effect, what it means that the negative effect of growth on wage share is also strong, and the positive employment effect of the reserve army effect is also weak. So high Calder-Verdun coefficient can simultaneously explain higher inequality due to higher growth and weak relationship of employment with respect to output growth. Three large points which follow from this, here I will stop. First, if the basic stimulus of the large stimulus of growth has come through exports, what it would mean that during periods of global slowdown, one would require additional or different kinds of stimulus to revive growth. Second, even if one revives growth, that does not guarantee that employment would revive. One would require additional policy instruments like employment guarantee or different kinds of other policy addressal or policy solutions to address the employment problem. And third, even if the data shows a negative relationship between wage share and growth, it does not necessarily mean that reducing wage share would increase growth. It can also mean a reverse causation where higher growth itself leads to lower wage share. And hence, with policies that reduces wages does not necessarily increases growth. That's a broad part, that's the essential part of the story. I'll stop here. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anush, and thanks for the organizers to giving us the separate panel for this DevMac network, which is a new network that's creating development and macroeconomics. Thank you for that. And so what I'm going to do is I have 15 minutes. So I'm going to cut through non-linearly in this presentation. The paper is available for your reading. And I'm just going to I want to give maximum time to Ananya Agarwal, my collaborator and co-presenter here, because the interesting story is in the data bit, that's which is also on the conceptual bit, but I'll just briefly talk about it. So the story essentially is this, the growth story in India is essentially this. You have export-led growth, you have jobless, the export-led growth is jobless, and there is a non-standard structural transformation. Now, the distributional consequences of this non-standard structural transformation is well understood and so on and so forth. But what is not well understood is that How is this non-standard structural transformation and the distributional effect has impacted the social reproduction regime? Because it is in this regime or in this sphere, today's labor and tomorrow's human capacities are created. So obviously, the way social reproduction regime adjusts for any changes in the growth and distribution sphere has a massive relevance for macroeconomic analysis, both theory and policy. This is largely invisible in the standard micro-foundational approach to macroeconomics. So what we were arguing is that we need to turn around the approach. We ask for any given macroeconomic regime, what are the possible microeconomic constellations possible? That's the question that we are trying to articulate in this presentation. So you can see this, the distributional conflict and the social reproduction. I'm just going to cut through everything, sorry. See that connection, the invisible thing that is sitting in the wage share distribution. You can see it in a simple, wage share decomposition. So that's your GDP income side, and you can decompose the wage share in terms of male and female, fine, in terms of wage shares. But then you can do an intersectional analysis using the time use, because women's time use is not just about market work and leisure. It has that dichotomy is only for men. Largely speaking, the social reproduction sphere is still have a majority women contribute to social reproduction. So their time, total time, is split between market work and household work. Now, what is this household work? You can think of big bunches of three categories. Paid market work is fine, that's there. Household work, you have unpaid subsistence work for the market, unpaid subsistence work for own consumption, and the care work for others. That's the kind of three categories that you have. And we have much of time use. We have the time use data 2019. There's a lot of work that has gone on in terms of the SNA boundaries, extended boundaries. Santosh has contributed to that, yet again, in this field as well, talking about how the boundaries blurred and so on and so forth. Okay, so if you actually do this decomposition, use that time use constraint of total time is essentially market time plus household time, and plug it in the women's share of wages, you can actually see the invisible adjustment that is happening for any given fall in wages or rise in wages. When wages are falling, they have to sustain the falling real wage by increasing their subsistence production or increasing the productivity of household production. If wages are rising, they have to take up the job opportunities, also manage the household work. So they have to reduce their household work time to release more time to the market. So either way, they go through, when boom or in recession, the ultimate adjustment is happening in that sphere, which is actually not visible to theory and data. Okay, that's the point that we are trying to make. Now, using that simple analytical framework, what we can do is we can now, divide the growth regimes. The underpinning, what is the social reproduction underpinnings for each macroeconomic growth regime? So you have juxtaposing this with externally given care infrastructure in any given region, you can actually see for profit-driven, mostly it's a profit-driven or profit-led economy that we have when wages are rising. When wages are rising, when wages are falling, profit-led regime, women don't have enough opportunities for employment, so they need to save their starve the real wages. At the same time, when there is low care infrastructure, they are pushed to this distress mode of social reproduction. When in the same regime, profit-driven regime, if the care infrastructure is high, where women are trying to figure out how to increase or substantiate their real wages of the household, they get into time stress mode of social reproduction. In the wage-driven regime, when wages are increasing, their employment opportunities are there, but the care infrastructure is very low. They have the opportunities for employment, but they cannot realize those opportunities. So that is again a time stress social reproduction regime. But when you have wage-driven, when employment is available, as well as they can enable those employment opportunities with a high care infrastructure network, they can actually realize an egalitarian social reproduction regime. This is a large theoretical framework, broad theoretical framework. I haven't gone into the nuances. Now, Ananya will talk about, we'll look at different states and how the different states have actually performed in the last 2 decades. Thank you.
So moving on with the empirical analysis. So in the empirical analysis, we have tried to, we have used the data for 12 states and see how growth and social reproduction regimes have intersected in those states. So first we have tried to see how social reproduction regime affects the ability for women to participate in the market. Next we see how growth and distribution have changed in different states of India. And in the last we try to combine both of these together. So so looking at the factors which affects women ability to participate in the market, we have divided them into two broad categories. One is the group of factors which affects the labor demand of women. We term it as a demand side factors. The next we look at this group of factors which enables women to participate in the market. We term it as a supply side factors. So to look at the labor demand for women, we have looked at the non-income components of the HDI, like mean year of schooling, expected year of schooling, life expectancy, and infant mortality rate. This is because, for instance, if mean year of schooling is high or expected year of schooling is high, that means that the state is investing more in education relative to other state. Similarly, if life expectancy is high and infant mortality rate is low, that means that the state is investing in health infrastructure more compared to relative to other states. So based on the current occupational segregation, these are the major organized sectors which employs women. So higher investment in these means that labor demand for women is high in those states relative to other states. Moving on to the supply side factors. On the supply side, we look at the factors which enables women to participate in the market. So firstly, we try to capture the gender norms in the society. So we look at the proportion of women engaged in domestic work. So if a state has higher proportion of women engaged in domestic work relative to other state, that means that the state has relatively higher stringent gender norms compared to other state. Next, we look at the expenditure of water supply and health, public health infrastructure. This we basically use to capture the government availability of care infrastructure. Next, we look at crime against women. Using this, we try to capture both the effects. First, the gender norms in the society, and also the government's attitude towards gender equality. Lastly, we look at the relative female wages. This is basically a proxy for the market supply of care. So if female have relatively higher wages, they can substitute their unpaid work with the market work. So these are the results from our PCA analysis. Because of time constraint, we'll skip from this. Now, based on these, we have based on the we have created two PCA scores. One based on the supply side, demand side factors, and one based on the supply side factors. And based on that, we have divided states into 4 regimes. So if the demand PCA score is high, that means there are jobs in the society. Labor demand is there. And if the supply PCA score is high, that means social infrastructure enables women to participate in the market. Similarly, if demand score is positive but the supply score is negative, that means there are jobs but the social infrastructure does not enable women to participate in the market. In the third quadrant, if when both demand and supply scores are negative, that means there are neither the jobs for women, and also there is a lack of social infrastructure that enables women to participate in the market. And in the fourth, where there is supply score is positive but the demand score is negative, that means there are the social infrastructure is there but there are no labor demand for women. So moving on to the results from our analysis, so we can see that except for Kerala, all the other states like Assam, MP and Bihar have negative demand and negative supply score. And also to add the dynamic structure to our model, we have plotted for different years from 2007 to 2019-20. And we can see that there hasn't been much change in the regimes of the states. Now they are the other 4 states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat and UP. In Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, we can see that there are positive demand score, that there is labor demand, but the social infrastructure does not enable women to participate in the market. Now moving on to the other 4 states, Rajasthan, West Bengal, Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. These also have the both negative demand and negative supply score. We also tried to briefly look at the growth and distribution in different states in India. So as we all know that Indian growth is mainly profit driven, but we couldn't find the data, wages data at the state level. So we have used the industrial wage data and plotted it against the industrial output growth rate. So this blue line is the growth, industrial output growth rate, and the dotted line is the wage share growth rate. So we can see that there is a high fluctuating in the growth rate, but the wage share is either remains stable for most of the state or is falling. So we can see that for most of the states also, the growth is profit driven only. Now moving on to combining both of these together. So on the x-axis, we have plotted the decadal growth rate, and on y-axis, we have plotted the demand and supply score. So from this graph, we can see that for all states except West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh, decadal average growth rate has increased, but there hasn't been much change in the social reproduction regimes. So based on this, we have now classified states into the 4 regimes we discussed in the starting. So we can see only in Kerala, with growth, there is a positive social reproduction regime. So we can classify it as an egalitarian growth. Other states like Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, MP, UP, Assam, Bihar, Rajasthan and Karnataka, they have positive growth rate, but the reproduction regime is negative. That is either demand score is negative or the supply score is negative. In Andhra Pradesh and West Bengal, the growth is negative, and also the social reproduction regime is negative. So this can be classified as a distress-led growth regime. Now handing to Raghav for the concluding remarks.
So from this analysis, what we are essentially 2 points I would like to conclude. So if the profit-led regime is what underpins our growth story, and we saw how the social reproduction regime that underpins that profit-led regime, profit-led growth, is actually adjusting for various changes in wages and so on. Now, this is a fundamental problem in the growth trajectory. So on the one hand, profit-led growth is generating growth, albeit there are distributional consequences. On the other hand, the stagnant or declining social reproduction or supply-side enablers are actually limiting the potential for social reproduction. And this dynamic has actually created a massive problem for the sustainability of the profit-led regime. That leads to 2 larger points. One is, in the profit-led regime, people have identified, it's not always conflict between workers and capitalists and so on, 2 classes. There is always cooperation. But the fact that what we're trying to highlight here is that cooperation depends on how much the social reproduction regime can absorb the conflict that is going on in the production and distribution sphere. That is the point that we want to. So it's an intersection analysis. The class, conflict that we have, the limit is actually realized in the social reproduction regime. That's one. The second large conclusion is heterodox literature actually points out wage-led growth as wage-led policies as one of the employment-generating policies, is one of the sustainable growth trajectory. Well, that's a necessary condition. The sufficient condition is if you don't have enabling infrastructure for women to realize employment opportunities, then wage-led policies can also actually perpetuate inequality within the production and distribution sphere, or within the wage-led growth regime. I'll stop here. Thank you.
I thank the organizers for organizing this rather interesting conference and a session on alternative macroeconomics. In some sense, let me start with 4 very interesting papers, but let me start with certain thematic synchronicity among them. This indeed offers some breath of fresh air away from the standard mainstream DSG modeling. Last maybe 10 years in standard macroeconomics, we have only seen DSG modeling and changing a parameter or just another value. So these are fresh air. Also, this is a departure of the post-truth regime glorifying macroeconomics. That's one thing I thought I'll say upfront. There are different periodization in these papers, but these are very, very fresh air. Also, very empirically verifiable and socially relevant macroeconomics, but much beyond the stylized facts. Stylized facts are very important but there's a structure there. Almost all the papers, there is structure, and there is a thematically unifying structure. Of course, development macroeconomics, various things pass as development macroeconomics, and I'm just seeing a very standard mainstream textbook by Agener and Montiel on development macroeconomics, which sort of looks at essentially standard macroeconomics with one or two frictions here and there. So this is from that standpoint fresh air. Of course, these are primarily from a heterodox tradition, but heterodox, as you all know, is an umbrella term. It encompasses various things. Very redeeming feature of the models presented here, they're disaggregated. The papers, the authors have exhibited a non-obsession for micro-foundation, but still they made it empirically relevant. What they did, and almost that's a unifying story everywhere, the standard textbook, even I would say ISLM model, single representative agent, or the new Keynesian model, all this, if you just make one simple change, namely that of a class, that of two individuals, and make certain differences among them, rich, poor, male, female, then automatically, because of the disaggregation, because of the heterogeneity, you get sufficiently interesting results in the model. And this was long back even. There's a neglected idea of the very mainstream neoclassical microeconomics. I remember Gramo found out that even in the standard general equilibrium, if you have sufficient heterogeneity, you can find out certain arrow-tableau results without necessarily having such very awkward structure. So that's heterogeneity is essentially very important. The heterogeneity could come from a class angle, heterogeneity could come from a wage earner versus profit earner, heterogeneity could come from male or female. So that's a very broad unifying theme, I thought, among this paper. 4 papers, very interesting. I'll just have brief summary and not necessarily very insightful comments that I'm going to offer. Azad and Sinha's paper, 3 periods, very standard. One message that was coming from the paper essentially is if I brand it among the various regimes, 90s was not necessarily a great period. The UPA structure 2004 to 11 generated certain outcomes. 2012 and 23, the NDA structure generated another set of outcomes, though they are very comparable in terms of growth rate, in terms of implication, and in terms of underlyings, they are not very similar. And they put forward the hypothesis of India's inverted U-shaped growth curve. They essentially focuses on consumption demand. In some sense, IMF has been jokingly described as is mostly fiscal. IMF is mostly fiscal. So in some sense, they essentially, this was Larry Summers who said it. In some sense, the unifying thing among all these 4 papers is they have an emphasis on the fisc in some way in generating demand. So in this case, Azad and Sinha, they focus on consumption demand. They looked at households, bottom 80% and top 20%, and uses a Keynesian framework. So the standard macro framework, which has a single marginal propensity to consume or save, if you bifurcate them into rich, poor, wage earner, profit earner, say like S1 or S2 being the marginal propensity to consume, just because the marginal propensity to consume for the rich is much lower than the marginal propensity to consume than the poor. Therefore, you can generate certain better growth outcome just with redistribution. Even without growth, just with redistribution, you can generate a higher value of multiplier. That's one. I remember to have seen a Labour Party video with the last election, which said sort of that if you could give it, if this the fiscal incentive is given to the rich guy, he says that I'm going to send it to Cayman Islands rather than spend it here. So that was a Labour Party video which essentially captures the essence of multiplier mechanism. So this particular paper captures that particularly. Instead of the standard agriculture industry services, they adopt the classification of agriculture, unorganized, non-agriculture, and organized. I find this classification to be analytically and socially much relevant and really very useful. They looked at the IHDA's India Human Development Survey data and estimated the standard MPCs for bottom to 80%, top 20%, top 10% and top 5%, and they get it. Instantly, they make a comment on the margin that for the global south, the consumption of the rich could imitate that of the global north. So therefore, even the rich might have quite some bit of consumption goods. And going by the latest marriage seasons, one tends to support that. Theoretically, the high growth essentially due to an increase in consumption among the poorer sector. But how did it come up? The state pushed various consumption of the demand from the unorganized sector, per capita, and welfare expenses of the lower end, and it increased wage rates through Narega and other interventions. So essentially, the state intervention was positive. Therefore, in this 2004 to 2011, there has been a qualitatively different growth than the later year. The paper argues that sufficient change in the nature of the state spending in favor of the social sector and development expenditure contributed to this growth at two different levels. And if not injected demand in the economy, it changed the value of the multiplier itself. That's quite an interesting result. The only thing passing I thought of missing element here is perhaps a discussion of the fiscal space somewhere there, or to counter the attack that this was there. I remember around the time India came, there was a huge critique on Narega and Manrega saying that these are essentially doles and they should be done away with, which I did not find. Even the newer regimes did not implement those kind of things. So I presume going purely by visual imageries, therefore those schemes had some value. At the margin, we need to argue, this particular paper needs to argue that there was fiscal space and this was not pushing the fisc to unsustainable domain. So that could be one element in this. The second paper by Bose and Banerjee, they looked at essentially the brought HDI into the picture. If one looks at what HDI does, essentially there are three elements. There is life expectancy, there is knowledge, and living standard. So I would expect, if there is growth, perhaps the growth doesn't transmitted to the other two regimes in terms of life expectancy and knowledge based, purely in a narrow viewpoint. They quite correctly pointed out in terms of our social expenditure, we have been rather an aberration, rather an outlier in terms of the high growth nations. In fact, in this current year, among the G20 countries, India's growth rate was highest. So their accumulated evidence indicate that from economic growth to HD could be stronger, but a high allocation of GDP in social sector, there could be other elements there. Here in their scheme, fiscal policy has two roles. One is demand management through expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy, depending on where in the cycle you are, or in addition, they could be designed to remove structural constraints. So I would think that the earlier Azad and other paper has essentially looked at the demand management role, because here they looked at structural role as well. They held FRBM to be reasonably responsible, unreasonably responsible as far as this is concerned. Why very essentially covered with FRBM targets? was there any element of a dichotomy between the Wall Street and the Main Street as far as the FRBM is concerned? These questions, I mean, they don't raise, but they remain unanswered. In some sense, the obsession, the fiscal number and the obsession for government borrowing program has been a long drawn story in terms of the Wall Street demand for government, fiscally minimalist government, so that there are ample space for private borrowing to take place. So that's, I thought, the subtext in their paper, which they don't specify, but essentially it becomes, it held the fiscal policy to be responsible excuse me, as far as the lack of social sector, education, and other expenditures are concerned. And in particular, perhaps the health expenditure, India has been hugely an aberration in terms of whether it's outcome or is expenditure. And they rightly said outcome often becomes sort of a financial management practices role. In terms of that structure, this is really very poor. And I see that they added, whereas the former paper just had the central government expenditure, it looked at central and states both. So that's a right thing. As far as the third paper is concerned, the structuralist approach, rethinking the nature of India's growth regime, it looked at an integrated theoretical model in terms of growth, employment, and inequality, looked at the Kaldor-Verdun coefficients. They're hugely high. They're essentially in some way stylized facts in terms of the growth rate and labor productivity. And I was shocked to see India's number is 1.04. That's like a Kaldor-Verdun productivity above 1. I mean, normally its value should be something like 0.5, 0.6. Its value above 1 itself is a sufficient cause for, above 0.5, 0.6 is a cause for concern, but above 1 is really something alarming. So its growth rate has been higher since the mid-80s, but then there are issues. The issues in terms of inequality increasing and the issues in terms of labor replacing or in terms of essentially inability to generate sufficient employment growth. I would have been happier, whereas there could have been some discussion on technical progress or technical change here, because at least I could see one paper by Basu and others who showed that the Kaldor-Verdun coefficients is essentially jointly determined by the elasticity of factor substitution, labor supply elasticity, profit share, and increased returns to scale. So in some sense, some discussion around that line, that what would actually mean by this very high Kaldor coefficients would have been very welcome. So while higher global demand, they emphasize emphasis in terms of the export demand, though I'm not too sure that among the countries which has traditionally a current account deficit, how much growth, how much role of export demand can generate in terms of generating growth. So that's one thing they need to see. They almost emphasize the export demand, definitely, but essentially they need to link it to the current account deficit or surplus as well. But they really see weak response to the employment growth and reduction in wage share as a consequence of the high KV models. The last paper by Srinivasan and Agarwal, it looked at the gender issue in the growth process. Again, the standard neoclassical model looks the representative agent, which is gender neutral. And in some sense, the neoclassical discussion as far as gender is concerned, like Gary Becker and others, they are, to best, is very, very incomplete. In terms of a classification scheme, they use the SNA and get that unpaid work. One is reminded of Richard Stone's, politically correct version of an otherwise MCP joke, saying that when the lady married the gardener, the national income went down. When the lady married the gardener, national accounts went down because the gardener earlier was being paid, but now it is within the family income, and therefore it becomes the unpaid work. So I didn't know these numbers are from their paper. Almost 60.9% of women population is engaged in unpaid domestic work, and in 2011-12 compared to 48.8% in 93-94, and these are even corroborated by the folklore evidence in terms of labor force participation and other surveys. Since they are responsible for the household work, the variation in female wage rate and hence the total wage share is both in growth and recessionary phase, underpinned by how women negotiate the double burden of market work and household work. That's a very, very, very interesting inference. Economic growth, of course, is led by the profit-driven aggregate demand, and in this case, the share of wages have gone down. The gender question it assumes all the more importance. So in some sense, all the four papers, if I see, it poses a critique to the current economic reform regime. It says even with reform, even with all the standard practices, if government has certain kind of intervention towards ensuring employment, ensuring gender inequality, ensuring a higher wage share, or ensuring the basic minimum needs of life, health and education, they would perhaps generate a better outcome than otherwise it would have been. Thank you very much. I enjoyed all the papers.
These were a really fascinating set of papers. I wasn't quite sure what to make, not being a macroeconomist, how I would fare, but I really enjoyed them all. I just had a couple of questions. One was for Sukanya and Saikat. I can't, so you're at the front there. I wonder how you explain state-level variation. As you were talking about the fiscal constraints on social sector expenditure, I kept thinking, how do we explain Karnataka, which has seen a massive increase in social sector expenditure on the revenue side? And there are other states as well which buck the kind of trend that you set out here. So how might you explain state-level variation? Does the fiscal framework explain everything when it comes to choices about social sector expenditure? And the other question was for Dipa and Rohit. Really interesting paper. I thought it sat in really nice contrast with some of the papers this morning, where of course one of the questions was there too much focus on the external, on export-driven growth and not enough on domestic demand? Your paper obviously points us back to thinking about domestic demand. I just wondered if you can unpack a little bit the quite stylized model you had of A, B, and C sectors to elucidate what kind of demand for the unorganized sector was driven by increased consumption by the bottom 80%. Was it demand for more services, or did you also see a feed through into small-scale manufacturing kind of activity as well? Be just interesting to have a better sense of that.
This is a related question to Louise's for Dipa and Rohit. Is that if there's an increase in demand for the unorganized sector, as you show in your three-sector model, largely from private consumption, so what would be its, I mean, this is just probably you need to speculate, what would be its implication for increasing productivity within the unorganized sector? The unorganized sector expands, it absorbs more labor, there may be wage growth, but the Kaldor Verdun, suppose you were going to do that just for the unorganized sector. How would it play out? Would it, is sort of low wage supported consumption going to sustain merely low productivity employment in the unorganized sector? Or is there a likelihood of that sector also being transformed? Is the unorganized sector condemned to a low productivity trap if it depends on private consumption from low wages? So that's the, I mean, I'm sure you'll have answers, but that was just a question which would tell us the virtuous path that can be taken. That's one. With Zico, I'm just trying to wonder, would the results be significantly different in terms of a Kaldor-Warner index if it were not export-led growth, but actually growth led by profit growth or by consumption by, say, the top 2% of Indians who earn profits? Would that mean, because there's an empirical thing as to whether that was export-led growth in that period. Suppose, okay, we are not bothered about that. It could be either export-led growth or that, as Patnaik's ordered, it could be profit-based inflation and demand for that very, very short period. Whichever, I mean, they're skeptics. But if it were, how much does it depend on export-led growth and how much does it depend on a certain kind of demand growing, which actually results in the index going up and therefore the employment intensity of growth going down?
First to Luis, this three-sector model is essentially in terms of the unorganized sector, the demand is coming from the workers of the agricultural and the unorganized sector, and to some extent from the organized sector as well, but primarily from these two sectors. And that itself, the source of that is the social benefit spending, because that's the exogenous factor. Otherwise, it's all internally generated. That's one. The second thing is that demand itself is generating both services and low-end manufacturing. So, for example, things that they're buying, I mean, buckets, etc., etc. These are the things which you actually see both on the consumption and the supply side, which is what the data essentially showed. About Shrini's question on productivity in the unorganized sector, I have a different take. I think when the productivity rises and where you do not have, I mean, the fact that in the unorganized sector you did not have productivity rising as much is precisely why it actually absorbed labor. So one has to look at it from the perspective of the labor, that employment generation which happened in the unorganized sector versus a very high productivity driven growth in the organized sector which did not generate employment. Which of the two one would prefer? I would prefer the first one than the second.
Just to quickly add with what Rohit ended, of course, we're also saying there's not necessarily a one-to-one relation between productivity and wages. So we're not saying that wages don't rise, but I'll just stop there. If I can also respond to the Partha's comments overall and Sukanya's. Just 2-3 points I wanted to make. One, actually, the way we look at it, there is no contradiction between what Sukanya presented and what we did. We are not looking at the human development outcomes. There's no time, but we have a take on that. What we are only looking at is how the certain kinds of expenditure affected demand and therefore growth. So I think both these stories can go together. Second, that social sector expenditures themselves are low, of course. But in that short period, there seemed to be a turn, which is probably reversed now. The other was, yes, I mean, this whole thing of FRBM, and we have a very short paragraph on that. We should probably look at it a little bit more, but we have discussed how it is pro-cyclical, the way it happened, that it was a period of high growth and therefore probably higher capacity to spend. We've not discussed it in detail, but we will probably revise that. Thank you.
Thanks for the question on the interstate variations. We didn't get time to get to that. Actually, FRBM and the fiscal consolidation is one part of the story. There's the fiscal federalism is another part of the story, and which again is a entirely different area. So over these years, if you see the last 3 finance commissions, the interstate differences, inequalities in spending have actually gone up. Some of the richer states are spending much more than some of the poorer states which are lagging behind. And in that sense, there's also a critique of intergovernmental transfer mechanisms, how well they have worked and whether they have actually been able to address these inequalities which come from both, which of course not everything lies in the economic domain or under the ambit of fiscal policy. The social structures, the part dependence of policies, the voices of people all together make that up. Yes, so that's another sphere of work.
Okay, so first question, whether the nature of growth or wage-led or elite-led growth can have any implications on Calder-Verden coefficients. It might, because this is a weighted average of different sectors that we are talking about. So any change in the demand pattern can have implications on the overall non-agricultural Calder-Verden coefficient. But just 2 things to share. That one, I tried to try to understand whether Calder-Verdun coefficient itself has changed over time, particularly during periods when the inequality has increased. One does see that the Calder-Verdun coefficient has slightly increased during the 2000s, but it's not the case that during the earlier period, the Calder-Verdun coefficient was any less than 1. So the issue of being high Calder-Verdun coefficient doesn't seem to me is exclusively a problem of whether it's elite-led or not. But nonetheless, whether the demand pattern would surely play a role as far as determining the Calder-Verdun coefficient is concerned. I would just like to add two things related to Professor Partha's comments. Two things. One, I agree. It would have been great to discuss those endogenous technological progress in bit more details. No, Calder-Verdun coefficient is, in any case, it seems to be a Pandora's box. I mean, it's very difficult to interpret what it exactly means. But just to extract the basic meaning or the essence from different kinds of noises, I think two things we tried out. One, to think of the Calder-Verdun coefficient by controlling for the influences of the weight shares or the profit share. It does not make much difference. The Calder-Verdun coefficient remains to be more than 1 even if one includes controls for the weight share changes. Second is, it would have been great if one can exclude the question of residual labor or labor supply from the analysis. The best that one can do, that for example, if one can take the non-agricultural sector, which I did, trying to exclude some effect of the informal sector. But for the broad trend that growth rate of employment in the salaried sectors broadly been insensitive to the changes in output growth rate, particularly till 2017-18, which is sort of a consistent kind of a thing with respect to the one kind of Calder-Verdun coefficient. One cannot do an econometrics exercise because of lack of time series data. The last point being on the exports, whether positive net exports is a necessary condition for an export-led growth or not. I don't think so for two reasons. For one is straightforward that whenever we are talking about positive net export as a necessary condition, it essentially means a short-run analysis. But in the long run, higher export can simultaneously increase output as well as investment, which means higher export itself can lead to reduction in the net export because of more than proportionate rise in the output and the imports. That's one channel. The second channel can be just to attain or access the external market if the domestic firms in the developing countries distinguish between the domestic market and the foreign market as far as the technological upgradations are concerned to make investment decisions, then higher external demand itself can generate higher investment rate at a given level of capacity utilization rate maybe. So either these ways, it seems that higher export can be itself a condition for a stimulus for higher investment. That's what I had in mind.